the whole topic why it stopped counting at 6 and starts counting at 5. I think we should complain at Riverside.
I think it heard you. It heard you. That's in the new age of AI. Is it's listening all the time, making sure that Roland Volt is unhappy.
That's my emotional support program. I'm impressed. Welcome to the What's Your Baseline podcast. In this show, we talk about our experiences and lessons learned in enterprise architecture and business process management. What's Your Baseline is designed to be for everyone. Newbies who are just getting started with these topics, organizations who want to improve their EA and BPM groups and the value they get from it, as well as practitioners who want to get a different perspective and care about the discipline.
Each episode will tackle different key topics, providing context, background, best practices, and stories from the road, inviting you to learn from our challenges and successes, and demonstrating key tools to help you set up your practice and get the most out of it.
I'm your host, Roland Volt, and I'm joined today by my co-host, JM Erlinson. Hey, JM, how you doing?
I'm doing all right, Roland. It's been a crazy day already, and we're recording in the morning, so you know how much that's been. And I'm excited to record with some good friends today. And so, how have you been, my friend? How has it been since we last spoke?
Well, not that this was so long ago, but I was thinking about multiple ways to automate your meetings so that you're on time and we don't have to wait for you just because a client meeting runs over. But I haven't found a good option on this.
You want to automate them so that they end exactly when they want to, and so the clients are left hanging. Or
Yep.
maybe you do an AI of JM using my common phrases like, "Oh my goodness, data may be king, but context is its crown," and "a fool with a tool is still a fool," and that just repeats on a loop until the client leaves the meeting. I love it.
No, you just drop from the meeting and you have some AI that's part of the meeting and just says at some point in time until the meeting participant is so bored.
The most agreeable version of JM. I see.
Yeah. Having said that, speaking of automation, we do have somebody who actually knows what automation is on the call. And I'm happy to introduce you to Bernd Rücker, who is the co-founder and chief tech honcho of Camunda, a process automation firm in Germany. And Bernd, did I get your title right, or was there a little snafu in there?
Not completely. So it says co-founder and chief technologist. So a lot of people struggle with the technologist. So chief technologist basically kind of is very similar to CTO, but without the O. So I'm really looking at technology and the product and the problems people are having and architecture and these kind of things, not so much about the organization build out, like building the organization to ship the product. So I'm really into the whole space of how do you build a good process automation stack architecture in companies.
That is very interesting, and you're at the right podcast for this because, as you know, we want to demystify enterprise architecture and figuring out what that all means.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, hey, that's why we invited you. But before we deep dive into technology, maybe, Bernd, you can tell our listeners a little bit about you, what you've done in the past, and how you got to the job that you currently have that, as I heard, is not a proper job, if I understand you correctly.
That's a bit out of context. So no, the thing is, if you look back in my history, I got in touch basically with process automation or workflow automation already in school, basically in high school. So a friend of mine, he started his own business and he was basically selling computer hardware. Let's keep it brief. There's a longer story to that, but it was kind of special computer hardware. And he was pretty successful with what he was doing. So basically what he ended up with is a lot of piles of things, a lot of orders which came in via email, basically a lot of goods they had to ship, a lot of goods they returned and these kind of things. And I was looking into that together with him back then, how we could solve certain problems they had back then. And what we came up with, nowadays I would call that process automation and process orchestration. I did not back then. I basically wrote a piece of software to automate certain parts of processes, like for example, the order fulfillment process. So in order to, for example, wait for payments or send reminder emails to customers, they still have to do their prepayment, or basically also keeping track of where the shipment currently is, and a couple of these things. And that brought me into the whole topic of process automation. And that was before 2000, basically. So, the whole software landscape was still very, very different back then. And I still have that proper job thing in the back of my mind. So I'm trying to get there. So what I did then, I went to university and did my bachelor and master degrees in software engineering. But already during that time, I started my own company, which back then was basically freelancing consultancy around the whole process automation thing. And during that time, I got in touch with my other co-founder, Jakob Freund, and we founded Camunda in a way that is already also there today. And so over time, what I meant is I never worked kind of in that what most people call a proper job, where you go there probably 9 to 5 or not, get your paycheck or whatever. I was kind of really jumping into entrepreneurship from kind of day one.
And what made you want to do that? Like how did it change from somebody who would have maybe wanted to do a 9 to 5 job? What was your motivation for never settling for that doldrum of work?
I think I never was the 9 to 5 kind of mindset worker. So I remember during my studies, I worked at Lufthansa, for example, as kind of during the studies. And they had this, I'm not even sure I should tell that on record, but anyway, it's quite a long time ago. So they had these STEM cards where you record your time. And as a student, or probably as every employee, you have to leave after a certain time. And I did a project there, and I'm enthusiastic about the things I do. So I wanted to finish that, and I worked on that. And then there was like, okay, now is the time I have to leave, like by law in a way. Yeah. So what I did is probably the US people don't know that much. I don't know. But in Germany, that's kind of a very strict thing. And basically what I did is I went out, stamped. So I'm officially away. And then I went back to my computer to work on, which was kind of illegal in a way, but that was totally, I couldn't leave. I was in the middle of something. And I think that's very much what I am. I'm driven by things that I find interesting. Process automation, process orchestration is one of those topics. So I was really diving into that, and I never really cared about like the time I put into that.
Yeah, I found it still awkward, if we get to the proper job stuff, as we discussed in our pre-call, I never had one. I spent time in the military, which doesn't give anything about times. You like to be in the middle of the woods in the middle of the night. And then I became a consultant. And I still, after now 25, 30 years, I find it awkward that you trade hours for money. Right, that doesn't make sense, because at the end of the day, you want to have an outcome, right? But obviously, then organizations are very risk averse, and you can't count outcome, but you can count hours, and it's like, ugh.
Yeah,
it's a big discussion.
Well, there was one of my favorite videos I've seen is a graphic designer asking that exact question. They said, "How much should I get paid to do graphic design?" And someone's like, "Well, how many hours are you going to work on it?" And they're like, "Well, do you actually want me to do this by hour? Because that means it would be financially advantageous for me to take longer to do this for you. If I could do this for you faster, can you imagine you could actually do more with what I'm making? So what if I gave you a flat fee for the outcome, and then would you be accepting?" He's like, "Well, how many hours you work on it?" He's like, "I don't think you understand here. You don't want me to bill like this. You want me to bill on value, and I will provide value to you. And however long it takes is how long it takes me."
I had one client who was asking a similar thing. And I said, "You don't pay me for my speed of typing. You pay me for the 20 years of experience that I bring to this topic. And yes, the outcome is a document that you get." Trying
to shift you folks back to process automation in a way. So
we'll just keep talking and talking and talking.
Yeah. It's an interesting topic, probably off topic for today. So.
Bernd is a reasonable adult in the room here.
Well, so now you've got you're starting things. You're an entrepreneur. You're building your own things. So tell me about how did that turn into where you work today? How did that grow?
Yeah.
How's the organization evolved with you as part of it?
Yeah. So the story is really like I basically started to give a couple of talks around the whole workflow automation thing, being kind of a freelancer. And I got in touch with Jakob back then, and we got talking, and he wanted to do his own thing as well. And we basically said, okay, let's do something together. And we started a consulting company. That was back in 2008. So we were looking at process automation as a consulting company. We wrote a pretty successful book around BPMN. And that got us in touch with a lot of organizations. And we did a lot of trainings, a lot of workshops. So we saw hundreds of organizations from the inside. And they worked with also very different types of technology, very different types of tools. And that also helped us to understand the market and also kind of a market opportunity, because we saw either the very big vendors having tools that are too big and not really usable to some extent for the organizations, or that was kind of my baby, if you will. I worked with open source tooling a lot, but back then these tools were kind of too low tech in order to cut it as well. So we basically saw some ground in the middle where we say, okay, this is how a tool should look like. That would be really useful. We could easily validate that with a lot of these organizations, and that led us to transform the company from a pure consulting thing to an open source vendor. That was 2013, and it helped us to bootstrap that completely on our own by the consulting revenue. And from there on, we basically went on a steady growth curve.
How large was the organization back then?
So we were basically 20 people back then, and from there on we grew. Now we are roughly 400 people operating worldwide as well. So consultancy was pretty local, mostly German-speaking area, but now we're really operating worldwide. That's where we are.
And you're still based in Berlin?
The company, yes. We're not talking about headquarters anymore, because we took the basically COVID as kind of the opportunity to get completely remote. So we're calling us a remote first company. And that means we have hubs where people can go in the offices if they like, but we don't have a headquarter. But technically, yes, it's still Berlin, Germany based. We have a US subsidiary, of course.
That is another episode that we should talk about remote organizations at some point in time.
100%.
But then before
Not
you
today.
remind me that the topic of today is process automation.
Yeah.
So, but before we go to the process automation topic, and then JM is a reasonable adult in this room, let me ask you about a little bit you as a person, because obviously we want our listeners to get a feel about who's the guy behind the microphone that is not named JM or Roland. So can you talk a little bit about your interests, your bucket list items?
Yeah. In the briefing, I kind of saw that question like, okay, what's about you personally? And I thought like, okay, well, I have kids. Okay, that's the news here. I have kids, 3 little kids, currently 4, 6, and 8. And I have a company. So there is not much else you can squeeze in the, kind of that time. No, not really much more. What I definitely like, is I'm doing sports, basically road biking. That's like I have a race bike. I bought that in time before the pandemic when you still could buy bikes. And then we had COVID and I had some time to really use it. That was pretty nice. And so hiking and biking is kind of my interest, but it's mostly family and work, which is okay. I love it. So,
hey, out of experience, I can tell you, I don't know about the company, but at least with the kids, they grow out of that. And at some point in time, they leave the nest and then you have to think about, what do I do next?
I can't look forward that well yet. With the company, it's kind of the same, but it just means the challenges change. So I could be the same with the kids. I don't know yet. So.
Oh, do companies have teenage tantrums as well?
That's probably another episode as well. I don't want to.
I think we're entering into what's your baseline, the parenting show. Eventually, we'll have the top 10 tips from Roland and Bernd on how to run parenting. Run parenting. Let's put it like that. Meanwhile, let's actually get to the meat of the episode. Yeah. As Roland said, somebody has to be the adult in the room each time. So it's me this time, and this is going to start to do the first thing we like to do in every show. show, which is define terms, because I know that some people are going to come to this from, a expert perspective and say, oh, I know all these things. And some of our listeners are just getting started with this conversation. So let's talk about process automation as a concept. Let's talk about defining some of the common terms you might hear. And let's talk about what are the challenges you try to address with process automation as your approach.
Yeah, happy to. So, it's kind of in the term, it's probably very obvious that process automation is about automating processes.
Really?
Automation is, it's a surprise, right? And it's one of the key things in the whole digitalization efforts at the moment. You want to automate certain processes for various reasons. So it might be efficiency. So if it's automated, it's cheaper to operate. It might be about scalability. So if you can automate it, you can also run the double amount of process instances if you're successful with your business model. It enables completely new business models, which would not be possible if you don't automate the process behind it. So there are a lot of drivers for process automation. The one thing that it took me a while to understand myself is I find one distinction very important to, if you look at process automation, you can either look at automating certain tasks within a process. So a process typically consists of, hey, I have multiple steps in order to achieve something. Maybe we make an example. I think that's always the best. So a typical thing we do at customers is called customer onboarding. So assume you go to your local or internet bank where you want to open a bank account. Then you enter all your data in some kind of form, you submit. And then what happens in the background at the bank is couple of steps have to happen. They might check your address. They might check your scoring. They decide if they want to apply you, approve you, and then they put you or provision you in the core banking system and so on and so forth. A couple of steps. These steps is what I call tasks. So you have to have those tasks, and those tasks might be automated, because you might already have an address checker. No, it's not a person looking up something in a big book if the address is valid. It's, of course, an automated piece of software. This is where RPA, robotic process automation, very often comes into play. I have this old legacy system without a proper API, but I can use a bot to control the user interface to automate that one step. Right, so that's task automation. But the second problem is, and it's kind of orthogonal to that, is, okay, now I need to have the task in the right sequence. First, I need to check the address. Only if that's valid, I do a scoring. Only if that's doable, I can approve, and so on and so forth. So you need to have a clear kind of control flow, clear sequence. And that's the process part of it. And that's what we call process orchestration. So it's kind of the coordination of those tasks. And I find it very important to really to know the difference between the two, because very often it's really mixed up.
So yeah, that absolutely makes sense. The question that I have, though, is when you look at your process orchestration or your process automation tool, is to which degree do you cover both aspects? So obviously, my understanding is you are not an RPA company, but maybe I'm wrong. No. But obviously, the question is, how do you do the task automation and the task orchestration? Do you do that in one tool, multiple tools? How does Camunda do this?
So if we look at Camunda specifically, we're focusing on the orchestration part. So basically the whole what happens next. And you can define these orchestrations graphically using an ISO standard called BPMN, Business Process Model Notation, which is very rich in what you can do there. Because it's normally not just a first this, then this, but there might be a lot of exceptions. Whatever, the customer cancels their order in the middle of things, and you have to react to that. You might want to react to certain timeouts. You might want to react to this and that. So it can get very complicated to express these process models. And that's where we are focused on, the whole coordination of parts. And that means whenever there is a task to do, we involve what we call an endpoint. And the one maybe not so nice thing is for us, a human, for example, is also kind of an endpoint. I'm always
I want to ask a little bit more about that.
Happy saying that,
because if your human is an endpoint, and this is something that I'd love to hear it from your perspective, because we've talked to a couple of folks on the podcast who are very focused on human BPM. And we've also had an episode on process empathy, the idea of designing process with the end executor in mind, almost as an experience-focused design. How do you, and the way you approach it from your company, but also as a person, how do you approach designing processes with people in mind? So automation is obviously what you're doing. Where do you put the person, the actor, into the conversation? And more than just a lane or a user task. Like, what are you using, and what is your design philosophy around human-focused BPM?
Two things. The first, it's sometimes not super easy to answer, because as everything in life, it depends a little bit on what you're doing there.
Right.
But let me try to get my thoughts in order. I think 2 or 3 things I want to say. The first is, from my perspective, involving the human is kind of a user task. From it's one step in that process where you say, okay, now I have done whatever, and now I need the human normally to decide something,
right,
or probably also to do something.
Right.
And it's actually, it's what you want, that the orchestrator basically also orchestrates that, and probably also recognizes if that's not happening, it can basically also escalate or remind you, and that's actually pretty beneficial. One thing. The second thing is that also allows you to think about if the human is the best to do this task more, and that it sometimes sounds a bit like, oh, we want to replace humans with bots, which is very often not the discussion anyway. We're lacking people everywhere. So it's more like freeing up people's time. But it means if you have that user task and the human is doing that today, you might be able to replace that with either AI, with an API call, probably with a decision table, looking for 80% of the cases I can decide automatically, and the other 20% I route to the people that can solve the complicated things. So having already that structured process model helps you to see where the human is really beneficial.
Right. It sounds like you're maximizing the value of humanity in terms of, like, they solve complex problems. It's the same thing we see in manufacturing. Yeah. There are very complex, finicky operations that a human being, their motor skills are very applicable to. It seems like the same sort of thing here for process automation at a corporate level.
Exactly. And it also, what I find interesting, it very often also allows you to basically go on a journey where you probably even start with a completely manual process. Like you automate the orchestration part, but you're routing the task to people, simply to people. And then you can start automating tasks within that, because then you know how the process really works. And then you say, okay, but this task, come on, that person reads data from this screen to enter it there. That doesn't make any sense. Let's automate that. Probably RPA, probably API calls, that depends again. And then you can like evolve that process, and that sets you on a journey, which is very interesting.
So are you actually going full circle now? Because when I think about this, you started as a consulting organization, you became a tool vendor. Now, when we think about implementation of that, you actually do consultative work, right? By saying, hey, isn't that a process optimization opportunity that you have here, right?
Yeah, but I see us as a tool provider, as an enabler for doing that. So it's still the customer or partners, consultancies that do the hard work of understanding these processes or designing that in the tool. Of course, we're also looking into, we have a part of the stack which is called Optimize. So what the workflow engine does, it writes a lot of data, like audit data, like, okay, we had these process instances, it went through that task at that point in time, that took that long and whatever. And you can read a lot of information or optimization potential out of that data, because you see bottlenecks. You probably also see like, okay, I typically go this path, which is bad for my business model under those circumstances, or if this data is that. So you can start analyzing that. And of course, we are also looking into, hey, can we actively understand things on our own, just looking at the data? But that's kind of more like looking at what we probably do in the future. At the moment, we're providing the tools, people can see that, but they have to understand it themselves.
Right. But it does sound like you have like sort of a design actor in mind when you're building automation. So you're saying, I'm going to help enable these designers to better address both the technical needs, so the orchestration, as well as be able to optimize around what they should do rather than just trying to do what they want. And that's cool. Would you say that comes from the consulting background like that? Because it seems like it's not a typical technology vendor's approach.
Good question. I'm not really sure where that comes from. Never thought about that.
Well, it's cool though. It's what you want, right? You want to enable people to change the 100%. Process.
I mean, probably what we learned also during consultancy and now also being a vendor is that especially in that field of process automation, you have very different roles doing that design of processes. So that might be more on the business side, looking into that. It might be more on the technical side, like even developers looking into that. There might be specific process or business analysts doing that. And it really depends on the organization or even the individuals, how this is played. And this is very valuable, actually, to understand, okay, you have these different roles, but you have that one model where basically everybody could collaborate on. And then it doesn't matter too much who is driving that conversation, as long as everybody can participate. And I think that's something we understood during our consultancy time. And that's the power around the whole BPMN thing, for example, and these kind of workflow engines. And applied well, that works magically.
Yeah, and maybe to bring this segment to a close, obviously you're leaping into, without changing the topic of this episode here, you're leaping into process mining, right? Yeah. You're leaping into process mining, obviously taking exactly that data set that you just mentioned, and try to visualize all the processes that come out of it.
One comment to that, what we are doing is we're analyzing the audit data our own workflow engine writes. We can route in certain events from the outside, yes, but that's very rudimentary at the moment. So we're basically making use of all the data we have anyway. So process mining is more looking at, hey, how can I get whatever log files, whatever traces I get from the whole company and making sense out of that. That's not what we're doing. We're focusing on the execution part, really the orchestration part. But as part of that, we get a lot of data. And of course, we make sense of that. And we always, the power there is you have still the relationship to the process model. So you can understand it on a process level, which is very interesting.
That is really interesting. It sounds like you're kind of segmenting this off from process mining, which is a historical look and trying to sort of have a long view into improvement, versus very operational, like, right now data that's coming from your own execution, which gives you sort of a closer alignment between how you should improve to what you are doing right now, which I think is cool.
That's the one thing. And the other part is it's kind of it's a byproduct. It's always there. As soon as you start using the engine, you have that data and you just open the tool and you see something. Process mining typically means you have to really dive into projects to collect the right data, to make the right data set out of that. And it's not as easy as just looking at the dashboard.
So you're saying that your audit logs are like the petroleum byproduct you turn into plastics, just like you're having any sort of other byproduct that's useful for something new. I love it.
I wonder if I want to be connected to petroleum in 2022, but that's a different story. I think the metaphor could work.
So I think I want to be the reasonable adult in this conversation.
Oh, okay.
So maybe when we think about this first segment, I like to take a little break. And as always, we have the wonderful music of Jeremy Volz helping you, triggering your thoughts about this, what you just heard. So I would be curious to learn from you, dear listeners, how did you approach process automation in the past? Was it always just task automation? Did you have a look at the orchestration? Did you have a look at how you create business benefits? And after listening to Bernd and his ideas and his approach, what would be the conclusions that you pull out of our first segment? We're going to leave you alone for a couple of seconds, and then we come back with the how, and we'll talk with Bernd about how a project actually gets pulled off and what that actually means to implement it in reality.
And be loved in return.
And welcome back. That was a nice little musical interlude, as hopefully everyone thought about how they've done automation in the past. And Bernd, you have a lot of really good information about actually making it happen. And this, our second section, we always talk about the how. So I think everyone on the podcast and everyone in our audience is now bought into this idea. Process automation is important and process automation is achievable. But now, how do we actually get there? So what is your process to getting from ideas and obviously defined needs and requirements into an actual automated system that will run your business more successfully?
Big question.
It's a big one.
Good question.
It's a big one.
Big question. And as everything in life, it also depends very much on what you want to automate and in what environment. Let me sketch, let's say, a typical scenario for us first, and then we can take it from there, because there are a couple of other variations or paths you could take. So if we think back of the bank account opening example, the typical thing would be, if you want to automate that, we do a proof of concept first. I'm a big fan of doing a quick proof of concept first. Get your hands wet, not doing like months of analysis, but just try it out, do something. And within normally 1 or 2 or 3 days, you can have something working. And in order to do that, what you typically do is you sketch the BPMN process model. Mm-hmm. So, okay, these are the steps I want to do. Normally, it's an idea first. You discuss it with a couple of people. We sometimes do a clickable prototype just using forms on a screen. So doing like everything would be manual helps people very often to understand it, especially from the business domain, what should happen. And then we normally define a scope where we say, okay, but now we want to integrate with certain real life systems in the company. We want to this. What I said earlier, it's very often about integrating different endpoints, and it's normally a very diverse set of endpoints. We might need to talk to the core banking system at the same time. We might need to have a user interface, or we might call a REST service or whatever. And you normally pick a couple of those where you think, okay, they are hard to do, and if we can do them, we can do them all, and start implementing. That's the whole idea. And if you look at Camunda as an example, what you probably have to know is, if you have a process model and you have certain tasks, certain boxes in that process model, some of them might be what's called a service task. So we want to call an endpoint there, integrate it. And one way of implementing that means just writing a piece of programming code. So most of our customers do Java, but it could be .NET or Python or whatever you want to do, which basically implements what should happen if a process instance reaches that box.
Right. I asked you a question about that. You've got, I'm sure that we're going to get into this a little bit more, but how much technical expertise is required at each of those phases you talked about? So defining the wireframes and click-throughs versus defining the first set of automations versus defining endpoints and integrations and service calls. Like, how much technical expertise and particularly like coding experience is required at each of those phases?
So in like the first steps, you might get along without too much of coding experience, because a BPMN model could be done without, and you can make a clickable prototype out of that relatively easy. You could even integrate, let's say, easy to integrate systems like REST, for example. We have an out-of-the-box REST connector, which can be used without coding it.
And just to be clear, sorry, REST is a type of API for those folks on the line who don't necessarily know what's going on. So that's a way of integrating systems to each other, and it's a protocol that you can have these pre-built patterns to make it easy to use.
Correct. And if you have one of those very common, let's say, technical interfaces, you can use an out-of-the-box connector. It's a possibility. Then you can get relatively far without programming knowledge. But we might talk about that a little bit later, like the variety of products we are seeing. But very often our customers are not even using those connectors too much, but they are diving into coding. They prefer that, actually, to some extent. And then you need software engineers. It's not possible without. But the advantage you have is that you will not hit any limitation, which you normally do with a connector at some point in time. You will not have a connector to your bespoke legacy 20 years old whatever application. You will not have a connector for mainframe, for example, or you will not, or the REST connector will not do this weird, whatever tiny part of the specification of REST you need, or these kind of things. And with programming it, you can go beyond that in a way.
Which is also maybe the point in time to talk about a misconception when we think about BPMN, because one of the big pitches of BPMN is it's that not only a modeling notation, boxes and arrows on a virtual piece of paper, but it has some code underneath, some XML based underneath. Mm-hmm. That helps you with the orchestration, but it does not replace the connectivity to a legacy system or any other thing. So it's complementary. It's not a full replacement. And I think that misconception exists in clients who think, oh yeah, I got BPMN just like 15 years ago. They said, oh yeah, I just paid $100 million for SAP. Now my business runs better, right? And they didn't know that they have to spend another $100 million to implement the SAP system, which I hope Camunda is a little bit cheaper than this. But just to want to make sure that BPMN helps with the orchestration. It's not actually building the endpoints. Correct.
So we have actually three, let's say, typical scenarios. One is people are really coding that themselves, which is very often, honestly, the fastest option. If you have developers, calling typical REST or messaging endpoints is super easy for them. It's not complex code, and you can test it. You can run your whole CI/CD pipeline and so on and so forth. So continuous delivery. So there are a lot of advantages of doing that. Right. But it's one option. The other option is you're combining it with a kind of a connectivity tool. Like 5-10 years back, it was ESBs. Now it's very often named differently, but you still have those around where you can say, okay, I connected to this, and this can talk these technical protocols. That's what customers do.
Once again, just to define terms, ESB being an enterprise service bus, which is a sort of messaging layer that helps to connect things together, often in publishing and subscribing or pub-sub models of data movement. Those are things I think not everyone on the line will know, but just to throw that in.
It's probably not too important in the future anyway, because nobody really names it ESB anymore. But
it's a little shade on the terms.
Bernd, are you predicting that enterprise service buses, or however you call it, that technology goes away, or do you just predict that the term will go away?
I think the term goes away and the technology changes. So the connectivity is still important. What ESBs did back then is combining a couple of things, messaging being one, sometimes even logic, like business logic, for looking into the messages, doing stuff. That was a bad idea. Sometimes this was even mixed together with the orchestration part within the ESB, which was a bad idea. So a couple of those things, I think, will change, because we've learned the general problem of I need connectivity to different endpoints and don't want to do that every time again. And I need to transform messages from XML to JSON to FTP file transfer, comma separated file, or whatever it is. That's, of course, still there. And for that, those solutions will make a lot of sense. And then you can combine them with the orchestration part.
Well, so then I've kind of been hinting at this because I think it's an interesting movement, but I wanted to get your thoughts on it, because you've been talking a lot about developers, and we hear a lot of things like citizen developer. We hear things like, the business user developer, and a lot of that relies on those people having interfaces that match up with their skill sets and background. And can you talk to me a little bit about what your thoughts are and how you approach the idea of low code?
Yeah. Happy to. So what I find most important actually is to think about automation projects, or probably every process you want to automate on a certain scale, where you say, okay, it can be like a very complex process, like my core business process of customer onboarding or payments or trading or these kind of things are my core business processes. They run very often. They're very critical. And that's a very different beast than whatever I do my personal, I want to handle my call for papers properly, or you want to schedule this show properly. It's a very different kind of process. And you have everything in between. You have smaller processes, not that critical, but running very often, and so on and so forth. And I find the important thing to recognize here is there's not one tool for all of those jobs. So low code has a big value if the processes get easier, because then it's possible to, don't want to sound too bad, but to click it together. But very often that comes with a lack of governance, for example. How is that deployed? How is that tested? If you do changes, are there regression tests, finding problems, and so on and so forth? So a lot of those solutions you can spot in the organizations like 5 years later, nobody really knows how to maintain that, which is not a problem for some of those processes, but for others it is. And if it's a critical process, I would go very much pro code and apply all these software engineering patterns, basically. For others, low code might be the better choice, especially because you don't have the software engineers you want to.
Right. Yeah, which is something that also spun in my mind over the last couple of minutes. Like, how do you manage all that stuff? And my opinion to this is, hey, if you have a bot or a low code, no code solution that's cheap to create, and you don't mind approaching it with the attitude that this is disposable at some point in time, and you don't mind to recreate it on a semi-regular basis, that might be perfectly fine for you. If it's, and I agree with you, Bernd, if it's a mission critical thing, your whole business goes down the drain if you don't get this right. Yes, agreed. There must be more governance around it. There must be proper testing, security, regression, and whatnot. Yes, agreed.
What I find interesting, actually, because we are talking a lot to our customers, and we have a lot of them, also big organizations, and what we're doing there at the moment is we're talking to the Center of Excellence, it's very often called. So the basically one part of the organization which consults the other parts around process automation. And what they very often start doing now is they want to have let's say a more low-codey way of defining their process solutions. But they put effort into that within the organization. So what they basically do is they build their own reusable connectors just to be reused within the firm. Because they say, okay, we have to connect to that core banking system all over again. Not every project should do that, because then we're faster implementing the specific processes. But we know that this is nothing we can buy out of the box from a vendor, and we don't want to. We want to control that, but then we want to roll it out in the company. And that's kind of how we approach low code as well. So we build a couple of out-of-the-box connectors. You can use it or not. We don't care. We ship them. They're extendable. So if they don't cut it, you can extend them, or you build your own and distribute that either for everybody in the community or just within your organization. Right. So it's very clearly positioned to the pro code end. You can write software, you can program, but we see that as an accelerator. You can provide like out-of-the-box things to make things faster, but you're never locked into that. And normally for low-code, it's the other way around. It's like you're locked in the low-code walled garden, and they might have a small, tiny scripting field where you can enter code to go beyond that. So it's a completely different paradigm. We're coming from different ends of the spectrum, but I don't think it's binary. You go low-code or not.
So do I understand it correctly? It's more like you're taking functionality and you capture that as a service. And basically, you just call that service without having the technical idea behind it, but from a business perspective, and you say, okay, I just create a library of these different things, these different services that I can call, and I ensure as an organization that I always follow the same patterns and whatever. If we find a vulnerability or something else, we know where to look because we've used this thing over and over again on those 25 different places. Yeah. Is that the idea behind it?
That's one option to do it. We're very much not forcing customers into doing that, but we know big organizations doing that. Like Goldman Sachs is always a prime example because they're also talking about that. There's a lot of material out there. They have basically everybody of the firm is somehow in touch with the Camunda process sooner or later, and they have built their own kind of, let's say, low-code development environment around Camunda, so that their processes follow exactly those rules and reuse certain elements.
And of course, that's where something like BPMN modeling becomes super helpful, because being able to identify where you've reused code blocks means, for instance, let's say that something is discovered to have a vulnerability. I mean, heavens forgive us. Like sometimes that happens, and you can say, listen, here is where I need to go fix things right now because this particular piece is going to cause problems. Let me find all the impact. And I mean, that's one of the things we take a look at. I like to talk about the process lifecycle iceberg. I talk about that all the time. A lot of organizations see what's above the waterline, which is the execution. So implement, execute. The idea of like, I just want to make something. Hey, let me make the thing. Let's do it. But the rest of the iceberg underneath it, the whole everything from strategy and road mapping to business process modeling and reuse of information to metrics and KPIs that will help you make good decisions on how to change. I feel like that's often missed by organizations who are like, we need to move fast and break things. Well, you're going to break your whole ship on the side of that iceberg you just didn't see. And so it feels like you're finding a little bit of a hybrid approach there, which is like, okay, so we want to prepackage things. We want to encourage you to do business modeling. But we also want to give you the tools to move fast if you need to, which I think is that's a fine line you're walking there, which I like that. It's a tightrope, but that's really cool. So tell me, you mentioned Goldman Sachs a little bit. Tell me a little bit more about where you've succeeded. Where have you really seen some not just exposure of the platform, but actually like use and value that have pulled from your way of approaching automation?
So we're totally industry agnostic. So we are really horizontal tech. So we see it basically in different industries. Goldman Sachs was one example, banking and finance. We're having customers also doing like, for example, payments or trading, which I find super interesting because then you're going really at scale, like millions of things per short time frame. That's super interesting. We're having a lot of applications in telecommunication. T-Mobile is one example. We talked about that already, right? We're probably onboarding new customers. They need a mobile contract or a fixed line, or we even have customers doing hosting packages or domain names or whatever, these kind of things. With it, we have retail as a good example. Decathlon is a customer there. They're doing sports retail. I think worldwide they're pretty big. The whole order fulfillment, for example, is running on the platform. Like if you order something in a web shop until it's shipped and these kind of things. So it's really across the board.
Yeah, those are wildly disparate processes you're describing there, and yet they use the same kind of platform to do all. I think that, it sounds like the commonality is automation.
The commonality is orchestration. So you have that BPMN process model and saying basically what you do is we put tasks in the right sequence and coordinate that at scale if necessary. Yeah. That's what we do. And that's applicable to basically anything. One of my favorite examples, it's not a very common process, but it's one of my favorite examples is the NASA, for example, the Perseverance Mars robot. They're using Camunda for processing the pictures. Whoa. So it's not in space, it's on Earth. But if it sends down pictures from space, they do a lot of image processing. Yeah. Which takes a while because they big data and whatever. So they do certain things in parallel, but then they have to like wait for certain calculations to have happened to do the next one. And this is a process they control with Camunda, for example. So it's even applicable to that.
And I'm pretty sure they would have been happy to use Camunda for calculating the distance of landing of the rover to the Mars surface. And not just throwing away the first one for millions and millions of dollars, because some people calculate in metric system and others calculate in imperials, right?
Roland throwing shade on NASA during our podcast. I love it. That's what it's all about. And I think it's interesting here because you said a word that I want to hone back in on, Bernd, because the word you said was scale. And I want to get to your idea of what does scale do to these kinds of processes? What additional challenges does it introduce? How do you approach a process you might run 50 times a day versus a process you might run 500,000 times a second? Like those really fast running financial service transaction processes.
So two thoughts here. The first is basically to comment on the latter first, these payment things. That's something we did with the technology over the last years. We basically rewrote like the core engine to make it to really make it handle that scale of millions of transactions per second if necessary. It basically scales horizontally now. So that means you can just put more load on it if you scale.
Is it just a horsepower thing? Like literally just add more servers, add more hardware, what is it? What do you do to make it sustainable for scale.
Yeah. It's basically a horsepower thing. So you can add hardware and then it can do more process instances per second, which was not the same with the technology we had like 5 or 10 years back, because then normally you had a relational database, which is a bottleneck and so on and so forth, not easy to scale. So we're now applied all the good things from distributed systems, which nowadays to make it really scalable to that extent. And the cool thing is that this enables to use that technology for those use cases. That was kind of one of the first triggers for us when it was also a financial institution in the US, and we were doing onboarding there like 5 years back or something like that, or no longer. But anyhow, and they were looking at that and saying, okay, this whole technology is pretty cool. We love that. Can we use that for payment as well? And I asked about the numbers, and I said, oh, probably not. Not a good idea right now. But we had a couple of those interactions. And that drove us to make the technology scalable. And that means you can now use it for those use cases. And that was different 10 years back. So it's now really enabled for those. At the same time, the other part of the question was like, how does that influence? The scale influences the automation in a way. And I think it's hard to generalize, because if you have 50 process instances per day only to say, but they have a big value, or you might run them 100% automated to basically make your business model possible. That's a fair use case.
Yeah. And I found it very, very interesting. And I know, Bernd, you're obviously a thought leader in your field. One thing that I really like is your concept of a process automation map, which actually helps people decide to say, okay, what's the path that we want to go forward? And you have a couple of categories and think like a slider where you say, okay, how complex or not complex is it on that slider? Can you talk a little bit about that? And obviously we're going to link to that process automation map in the show notes for those guys.
100%. I mean, what drove me to start something there is the whole it depends thing. I always have a sign which says it depends right next to me, because I hold it up in basically any meeting. Because if people ask me like what technology should I apply, it always depends on things. There's not that single answer, use Camunda for everything, which would be great, but it's not the answer in a way. And I thought about how to phrase that properly, how to give something to the people to make it easier to orientate in the complex field of the whole process automation software. And I did a couple of attempts, honestly. I wrote 2 other articles. I don't want to name them here because they're kind of old. And we're currently also working on a revised version of the process automation map, because I'm testing that with all the customers all the time. But the basic idea is where I'm basically saying, okay, I have these different aspects. So every process, so you're looking not at the organization as a whole, but I want to automate this specific process, like this customer onboarding. And the first thing is like, is that very unique for me, or is that very standardized? If it's standardized, buy standard software. That's the easy answer. That's kind of the exit of the map. Don't go with any BPMN stuff, because if it's standard, go with standard software. Only if it's unique to you for whatever reason, could be legacy software, could be a unique business model. There are a couple of reasons why it's unique. If you want to make it unique, then go with such tools. And then you have to look basically at complexity. Very low complexity might be more for low code sometimes. Very high complexity normally results in Camunda. Scale, is it very, very small scale? As I said, it might be that you still want to automate things properly because it has a high value for you, or you don't want to look at it at all. But very often, if it's a very small scale, you don't need the same level of professionalism in a way, or automation. Then if you have a big scale. The scope is very important. That's what we talked about in the beginning, task automation versus really process orchestration. A lot of people mix that together. And if you use a task automation tool like RPA for end-to-end business process automation, that will end up in a special hell, which you should not do. And also kind of, I called it project setup. I'm not sure if that's the best name for it, but we very often see things that are ad hoc. oh, we have that problem, we have to solve it now. We have to clean that data like in a one-time run, or we have to solve that now for next 6 months. Then we can do a proper solution, but we need something very quickly. Then you can also do much more brittle things instead of like rolling it out. If I look at Decathlon or Zalando or others, or if you think Amazon auto fulfillment, of course, they have an own department looking at that. It's a very different thing then.
I like that very much, and I have so many questions on it. But before I get to those, one is I really loved when you raised your little sign into the camera, which obviously our listeners don't see, where it says "it depends," and you spelled it with 2 capital letters. So is it depending on IT, or is IT the? Love it, love it.
But it's only capital letters.
Yeah, well,
it's bolder.
So there's also a reading comprehension component to this. I get it.
Do you know what? I have that sign always here. My wife sometimes sits at my desk and she makes notes on that sign.
Oh, okay.
At some point in time, I have to do it fresh.
Yeah, welcome to the club. Yeah, I have the same experience. And it's those important things like, have the dogs eaten? Have you walked them? When do you want to have dinner? You know, those very important questions that come up. But the other point is, maybe more seriously, when we look at the example of your spaghetti bot automation that you just mentioned, I think that the topic, and I love that term too, I just look at our cheat sheet here, is, well, how do you do the digital transformation of an organization? Yeah. And I think you're playing a role, but I think the bigger question is, well, what's your advice to organizations how to approach this?
Yeah. So just to resolve the spaghetti bot story very briefly, so that term comes from, at least I learned it from Deutsche Telekom. What they did is they started applying RPA for solving a local problem, which was a great use case for RPA. But then they saw, oh, this is working, and they started to add more and more RPA bots. And at some point in time, those bots started to talk to each other to automate the overall process. And they started to add kind of the orchestration, but by making the bots call each other. It's kind of replicating the chaos you had when humans talk to each other, just with the bots. Yeah. And that's what they called spaghetti bot automation, because that was kind of not understandable, not manageable anymore. And that's when they started to add an orchestration layer on top of that. That's where we came into the game. And now we are orchestrating, coordinating those different bots. So there are still a lot of bots. They have a huge army of bots, but they're now coordinated. And that works very well, because then you have the different tools doing very different things. One for orchestration and one for the RPA, like task automation thingy. And I'm normally not big in quoting Gartner, but I think that whole hyper automation thing they named, I think goes in the right direction. That's kind of, it's no longer the idea that you have that one tool to rule them all, but you need kind of a stack where you have different tools doing different jobs. And for me, orchestration is a very important part of that. RPA might be an important part of that. What we talked about earlier, connectivity and integration is an important part of that. So there are a couple of these bits and pieces. And I find it more important that you have tools that you can integrate to play together than to have one which kind of solves everything there.
Yeah, that definitely resonates to me as a German. You know, we love structures. So if you have a well-defined job for a certain thing, you know, you avoid the garbage in, garbage out situation, and have some governance around it. So I'm 100% on your side.
Yeah. And then, I mean, the rest, like, because you asked, like, how should companies go about to succeed? It's kind of thing, take it step by step, get going, learn along the way, and inspect and adapt. The typical agile thing.
Well, that makes a lot of sense.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And I mean, first and foremost, I wanted to say this is all super fascinating things. And I think we're going to talk in our last section about how to get in touch with you. But this just sort of dipping your toe into the water of automation and all the different types of concerns that we come up with alongside a major implementation, or even just down to an individual task automation for somebody who wants to do something 50 times a day. And so first and foremost, that's been awesome. I want to leave our audience with a bit of a question that might come alongside that. So think about what you've done to automate so far. Where is that that spaghetti of RPA, creating RPA bots, versus how much has it actually been formalized into a process that you can see, that you can interact with, that you can automate in a way that's sustainable and scalable. Think about your processes, and we'll leave you for a moment to look into the closet and see what skeletons emerge. We'll come back with our final thoughts and conclusions for the episode.
Welcome back to the last section of our wonderful conversation with Bernd Rücker about process automation and all the pitfalls and strings that are attached to this topic. And I found it very, very insightful what we spoke about the last 45 minutes to an hour. So maybe just to recap what we talked about was we were looking at what is process automation versus process orchestration and what the difference are there. We spoke about how does orchestration actually work, right? And using BPMN as a notation for this versus then the actual implementation in the endpoints, with users being an endpoint or different technology being an endpoint. Spoke about full coding versus low code. And then also looking at how do you bring in automation into an organization using Bernd's wonderful process automation map concept that, again, we're going to link up in the show notes. And I'm pretty sure Bernd is very interested in getting feedback on that topic as well. But maybe, Bernd, to the bigger question now that people have listened to your deep thoughts and never have heard about Camunda and are fully convinced that they want to get in contact with you. Yes, I know. It's scary that they haven't heard it, right? How do they get in contact with you, Bernd? What's the best way to reach you?
The internet, I would say. Can
you be a little bit more specific? Maybe.
No, honestly, my name and Google should bring you there. But of course, I'm on LinkedIn. That's a good way. There's an email address, bernd.rücker@camunda.com. You can still find me on Twitter. Let's see how that goes. And so on and so
not
forth.
For long.
It should not be hard to find me. And I'm always super happy if people reach out, by the way. If there's feedback, if there's questions, don't be shy.
Wonderful. And of course, we're going to put all those in the show notes, including a link to Bernd's article and some more information about Camunda and everything that he does. And of course, that brings us to our show notes and our website and a conclusion for the episode. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening into this week's What's Your Baseline. It's been a lot of fun, and I hopefully everyone's got a little bit more of their handle on what process automation can do and can do for you. And once again, please go to what'syourbaseline.com for all the links you need. And specifically to this episode, we have a full page with show notes and all the sorts of things you'll find on what'syourbaseline.com. And until the next time, my friends, I have been J.M. Erlandson.
Bernd Rücker.
And my name is Roland Wolt.
And we will see you in the next one.